Fadlo, Khuri, good afternoon. While presenting the achievements over the last 5 years, from launching the Twin Campus in Paphos, purchasing the first ever community hospital in Kisrwain, launching AUB online, overcoming existential crisis, to extending your mandate as president to 2030, you quoted those milestones with pain, loss, and failures. In the commencement speech addressed to students graduating, a celebration of success, you decided to celebrate a pioneer failure. In your perspective, right after extending your mandate, you named it Mystery Train, and you referred to the wasteland and particularly those lines. April is the coolest month breathing. Lilacs out of the dead land mixing, memory and desire stirring, dull roots with spring rain. Why this dichotomy? Is there a detachment feeling or a new belonging? Is it a pivotal period for you?
Thank you, Simon. So maybe I should step back for a minute and say that for me, ever since coming here, it's all about teaching people, teaching groups, whether students, faculty, or staff, and convincing both individuals and communities to take the right kind of risk, which comes with failure. You know, from my opening day remarks, my first year here, which was about engaging with life without a safety net, you know, walking a tightrope of life without a safety net, I think we've been very, very consistent. And after the last particular president's perspective that I quoted both Elvis, and I talked about how my interpretation of Elvis was different, and then T.S. Eliot, where I wouldn't dare to publicly say what my interpretation of him is. I think the basic message that I was sending, I was using a dichotomy to say that in every moment of despair, there's hope. Even in these darkest moments that we see what the people of Gaza and South Lebanon are undergoing, what the world is undergoing, because it's not a particularly happy time for the world.
Exactly.
So the messages, I think, have been consistently about life springing up in the midst of death, as Eliot so beautifully captured.
How do you interpret the following lines? She knows there is no success like failure, and that failure is no success at all.
That's from Bob Dylan's famous sign, "Love mine is zero, no limit." And what he's representing is a lover whose love for him has no limit, but at the same time, the dichotomy is he presents her fragility, her fragility contrasted with her infinite love. And those lines, "but there's no success like failure, failure is no success at all," indicate that in our moment of greatest ability to learn, it is when we fail spectacularly. I'm not saying ruinously, but it is the great failures in our life, the extremes, the great failures and the great successes that teach us the most. Now, my observation of human beings is they celebrate the successes, but the lessons learned from those successes tend to pass and fade with time. But the lessons that we learn from our failures stick with us for the rest of our lives. And that's the way I think Dylan wrote it. Now, to be fair to Dylan, they used to teach classes about his lyrics in colleges across the world in the 60s and 70s. And when asked to comment on some of the most, one would think, obvious lyrics, like in Desire, or in the even greater albums just before that, Blood on the Tracks, which was at the time of his divorce from his wife and the mother of his 4 children, he said, "I just liked how the words rhymed." Great poetry, great art is there for our interpretation, and that's my interpretation of Dylan's words.
You linked in one of your speeches loss to persistent hope. Can you please elaborate?
So, loss is a sense that we all feel, all humans feel, loss of loved ones, loss of hope, loss of career opportunities, loss of purpose even in some cases. But I think that as long as you can tie that loss to hope for something meaningful, not saying that the loss needs to be sacrificed, but hope for something meaningful, this gives people the endurance, the resilience, the determination to move forward. The last 5 years, we've experienced from many in this country and in this region, and to a significant degree the world, a sense of loss. Loss of the people who immigrated from this country after the port explosion. Loss of people's life savings. Loss of the sense of security, as small as it might have been, that people had in Gaza and the West Bank. Loss of belief in systems that we've seen reflected in major Western democracies and elsewhere. Loss of loved ones from the pandemic, extraordinary losses all, and individual losses. People felt that their hopes, their careers went in directions they did not previously hope for. And yet in each of these losses, we need to hang on to a persistent sense of hope. What can we learn from that loss? How can we take it forward? How can we do something meaningful still with our lives, with our limited time on this planet? And how do we tie that not just to hope for us, but how can that loss inform hope for the greater good? And that's what I was talking about there.
On this same theme, loss and hope, how do you interpret the following statement? I'm going to say it in French, then how it translates to English. Point ne besoin d'espérer pour entreprendre, ni de réussir pour persévérer. It reads in English, one need not hope to undertake, nor succeed to persevere.
For me, it ties to with the subject that we were just talking about, which is that some of the circumstances that mankind, let's zoom out from the individual, has been most persistent after, have not necessarily been tied to success. You can talk about success that led to things that ultimately perhaps were not for the betterment of mankind, splitting the atom leading to the atomic bomb, okay? But you can think of other losses, the collapse, for example, of the Athenian democracy under pressure from the Macedonian army after Demosthenes challenged Philip and Alexander, despite the defeat of the Athenian democracy and the end of Athens as an independent city-state, Alexander would spread the culture of Athens everywhere, right? That was the closest thing to a Greek culture they sent. And it's particularly resonant for those of us with an Arab heritage. Think of the beautiful poetry, not just, as we'll discuss, I suspect, of Imru al-Qais, his poetry of loss and of love and of despair and regret. But also the Andalus, the great poets of the Andalus, talked about the loss of Spain and receding away from Spain into North Africa. And this is also the currency of today. You see much of the finest Palestinian poetry and the finest Lebanese authors have been stories of loss. Amin Ma'alouf's Le Rocher de Tanyos, and some of the writings of Ghassan Kanafani particularly, or Mahmoud Darwish, resonating with the sense of hope coming from loss. They didn't succeed. Mm-hmm. The mountain truce and alliance between the Christians and Druze faded after several hundred years together. In the 1860 novel, or it's placed in 1860, Le Rocher de Tanyos, and yet there's a kernel of hope at the end of that. And so this is what I'm talking about. You don't have to succeed to persevere, to believe, to have hope.
We continue to mourn the mounting losses of pointless wars, which resolve next to nothing. Please elaborate and tell us, how do you see we lost the land?
From my perspective, just to be clear, I'm a true believer in nonviolence. I don't believe that war leads to better things. It does lead to results. How the Palestinians lost their land. I'm not a historian to comment, but they lost their land because clearly the Arabs were not prepared to do what needed to be done. And the West allowed the Israeli aggressors to take the land, fully supported, legitimized, without thought of consequence to those who were left behind. And I don't want to overstep my bounds. This is where the great historian Constantin Zrei came up with the term Nakba, the catastrophe. What I'd rather talk about briefly is AUB's role in that, because that I am qualified to talk about.
Yes.
So AUB
Remarkable role.
played a huge role. As I said in the first conference on rebuilding the health sector in Gaza, the hopes and also the practicalities of what needs to be done after this war is over, AUB to some degree is the alpha and omega of 20th and 21st century Palestinian academic life. We graduated George Habash, we graduated Wasf Tal. George Habash, who was a physician, and of course, he would call himself a freedom fighter. Much of the West called him a terrorist. But Wasf Tal, who ended the Palestinian armed presence in Jordan. So the university has graduated any number of significant figures in the history of the Palestinians, among them the most recent prime minister to receive high praise, Salam Fayyad, who's currently a faculty member in Princeton, who I had the opportunity to spend time with. So here, when I talk about loss, what AUB does is it preserves institutional memory of the purpose behind a people's history, their destiny, their losses, their loved ones, their successes. It's where I find that the archives play an enormous role. Not only the archives we have in the Jaffet Library, but the wonderful repository, in addition, that is the Palestine Land Studies Center that Dr. Salman Abu Sitta donated. So for me, there is something that is critical here. Education and history give you a reason to have a culture. For me, nationhood is an expression in its best form of a contiguity and evolution of cultures. It is not a reason to say, my culture is superior to your culture, which is the way we're seeing it being used by the populists and demagogues in the 21st century, who seem to be repeating much of what happened during the interwar period that resulted in World War II. I'm not predicting World War III, but I'm defining nationalism, patriotism in different terms. For me, it's a cultural impact, a cultural legacy. It's not a racial or ethnic or genetic superiority excuse. And AUB, of course, teaches that. It teaches people to respect other people's background and not to use their background as a ledge from which to look down on people who they consider inferior to them. To listen to other people's point of view, cultural, political, religious, or otherwise.
Yeah, sure. I'm quoting, "A university is not a service station. Neither it's a political society, nor a meeting place for political societies. With all its limitations and failures, and they are invariably many, it is the best and most benign side of our society insofar as that society aims to cherish the human mind."
So that's a quote from Richard Hofstadter, the distinguished professor of history at Columbia University in 1968. It has a very specific context. That commencement address was given not on the Columbia campus, but in the Church of St. John the Divine. It was not given by the president of Columbia at that time, because he had called the police on the students and fractures appeared in the Columbia community between the faculty and some who felt the students had every right to protest, the administrations, the alumni, things that are very similar to what we're seeing today. But that speech had an extraordinary resonance. Between that speech and the Kelvin Committee's findings at the University of Chicago in 1968, they defined two very important things in academia. One, what a university is and what it is not. What a university is, as you hear Richard Hofstadter say far more eloquently than I can, is perhaps the greatest, most benign, and yet most fragile entity we have, the most irreplaceable entity we have in society. And the rest of that address, he goes on to urge the community, all the community, the students, the faculty, the staff, the alumni, and the community of New York and America to preserve and protect Columbia University. He also touches on the fact, as did Harry Kelvin at Chicago, that universities should invite a diversity of opinion. The more extreme, the better, as long as there is no threat of violence or harm. And by that, I want to be very explicit for those who claim they're being harmed by hearing speech that's offensive to them. He was talking specifically about physical harm. Physical harm, not hearing someone insult you or insult your ideology. I never agreed that that was harm. And you saw the president of the University of Chicago a few years ago again take the first step to say we don't believe in limits to free speech, to academic freedom. And this is a point that I think is underrated given the assault both in the United States Congress and by the media in many situations. Well-meaning media, ill-meaning media, it doesn't matter, on the principles of academic freedom. Academic freedom allow a diversity of opinion. They require a diversity of opinion. But that diversity of opinion, which can be divisive, is in this remarkable city on the hill that is the university. And that's why Hofstadter ends by urging people to appreciate, to protect, to preserve, to celebrate the university for what it is. And what it is a place where real learning and exchange of ideas can happen to a less inhibited degree, to a greater extent than in any other forum that we have in society. It is the forum for exchange of ideas, discovery of new knowledge, that if we had to invent it, it perhaps, had we not stumbled on it, it would have taken us thousands more years to come to it. So what does academic freedom mean in the local context? What does it mean for AUB? What does it mean for Lebanon and the region? One of the reasons why academic freedom is so precious, and I read an article in the New Yorker that essentially said academic freedom is something that we would miss. The folks in the US who are not fighting for it effectively enough would miss it when she's gone. As the famous Bob Dylan line said, "You're going to make me lonesome when you're gone," is that it underpins the principle of everything we do here, especially. Lebanon is in a very difficult region. And if it has an advantage, it is that this country has more freedom of speech for more people, not just freedom of speech for certain people, than any other country in the region. From Turkey all the way to Pakistan. And the advantages of that academic freedom are best understood at the universities. This is why we don't interfere when the students use foul language to express themselves about certain leaders, including yours truly, okay? That is why we don't curate what they say, nor the faculty. Of course, we prefer politeness and decorum, but it's not on us to impose a code of conduct, politeness or decorum, on how people protest, on how they express themselves. The minute we start to do that, we will lose the advantage of this country and particularly of this university. So academic freedom is really the life's blood of AUB.
In one of your writings, you mentioned reading the novel of the Three Musketeers while your family was sleeping and you kept awake during periods of insomnia. Fadlo Khuri, what are you reading nowadays?
So I have a bad habit of reading multiple books at once. I'm trying to finish Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things before she arrives and doing a bad job of it. I just finished reading a biography of arguably the president from the U.S. from the 20th century I most admire, Kingman Brewster, and I'm reading a book that was given to me by Kai Bird, which is his most personal book about his experience growing up under Mandelbaum's gate. So I read a little bit of this one, read a little bit of that one, read a little bit of the other. All of this is to try to inform me of the human experience, more often now in the 20th century. As we've noted previously, I like to read things about the 19th century. I like to read things about previous periods. I've just finished a book by Christopher Clark called Revolutionary Spring about 1848, which was the year of uprisings all over Europe. And it's a striking book. One of the things that emerges, of course, is that 1848 perhaps was the most critical beginning of the schism between liberals and communists. It was a time after which the two camps understood that they likely could not coexist, or the ideologies. But I read these things because I've been an insomniac now for more than 30 years, and that's the result of very personal experience. I used to sleep like a log all the way through the Civil War. They blew up the bottom floor of our building. I was the only one, I think, in the building who stayed awake, even though the glass in my room cracked. But in 1993, 1994, when I was working in an emergency department, I saw a couple of sudden infant deaths. It's one of the worst things you can imagine. And it turned out to be a very simple solution to prevent it, as you lay the child on the side and their breathing doesn't stop. However, having pronounced 2 infants, my sleep has never been the same. So all the way through my teen years, I would walk in and check and make sure that, my children's teen years, I would walk in and check that they were breathing. But the sense of insomnia gave me an opportunity to read while the world was sleeping.
You referred in your speech to Umru al-Qais poetry describing the ruins, lamenting the ruins of homes, sorrowing the loved ones who left and did not return. Is this disappointment or regret?
It's regret. I think it's clearly regret. Umru al-Qais sees that he has lost irreversibly his kingdom, the houses, which he describes in great detail, his lover. He describes the animals which were there, and he looks at a period in his life that he knows is now over. And you can sense in every word of this poet, which in my opinion is dripping with regret but not despair, a sense that every one of us feels of opportunities lost in life. I mean, obviously, for him, this is a devastating sense of repair, the loss of loved ones, of home, of all things familiar. So nothing is left but sand and ruins, like the famous Shelley poem about Ozymandias. However, in that regret is a prompt, at least for this pathologic optimist, that we turn every sense of regret to an opportunity to do better if given the opportunity again. And that's why I love the poetry of Umru al-Qais, among others. So talking about regrets from a personal or institutional perspective, regrets are about decisions, not that you made mistakes, but that you weren't honest with yourself about why you made them. If you're honest with yourself and you make a mistake, you can correct it most of the time, if people are willing to cooperate with you. From my perspective, regret is about something that you should have done and didn't do. Not something that you did the right thing and it turned out to be the wrong thing. So from my perspective, we've brought great leaders, we've brought great faculty, we've lost great leaders, we've lost great faculty. This is the normal life cycle of an institution. We've had opportunities that you started out by discussing Cyprus, AUB Online, Kachar Medical Center, that we've actualized. We've had others, Dubai and elsewhere, that didn't work out. I don't regret the ones that didn't work out. I would regret them if we hadn't thought them through and made every good faith effort to make an informed decision one way or another. So for me, regret on a personal level is when you don't make the effort to do the right thing and to be informed. And that's where life can be challenging, because I agree with Colin Powell, who once said that once you have 30% of the data to make a major decision, you make that decision. If you wait till you have 70% of the data, it's usually too late.
On this note, Fadlo Khuri, I thank you for this chat. I am sure a lot will enjoy watching it. Others might criticize it. Even others will encapsulate pretentiousness. I don't know. Let's hope to make more mistakes, try new things, learn, take risks, and upgrade our relationship with failures. Thank you.
Thank you.